Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the United States Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Water and Energy, What Connections Can We Draw? We're grateful to our moderator, Dr. Ning Lin from the University of Texas at Austin, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. We're also grateful to the University of Texas at Austin for sponsoring this webinar today. First, a little bit about the United States Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest affiliate of the International Association for Energy Economics and provide a range of products and services that address the needs of energy economists, such as our two professional journals, our quarterly newsletter, and we also produce conferences and virtual events on the field of energy economics. If you're not a member of the association, we welcome you to join by visiting us at www.usaee.org. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot attend the live event so that you may listen to us on your rewind at your convenience. If you have questions for our panelists, please use Zoom's Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've left sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. It's normally at this time that I would introduce our moderator, Ning Lin, who is currently unavailable to join us. So I, as Executive Director of the Association, will be leading this webinar. I'd like to first introduce you to Vincent Tidwell, who is Principal Member of the Technical Staff at the Sandia National Laboratory, to give his presentation first. Vincent, over to you.
Excellent, thank you. Well, all right. All right, thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Vince Tidwell. I'm at Sandia National Laboratories, and I wanted to start this little webinar off by talking a little bit about how water and climate influence the electric power sector, and particularly how it influences future planning exercises. And I want to start by recognizing the many folks that I have had the opportunity to work with over the years, a variety of different labs and universities. Also need to recognize the Department of Energy, who supported the work that I'll be talking about. And so basically the way this talk is broken up is into two pieces. First, I want to talk a little bit about how water impacts the energy sector, the electric power sector today. And then we'll talk a little bit about some ways that we can help make our energy sector a little bit more robust toward water. So currently the setting is that the electric power system, thermoelectric power, uses more water than any other sector in the United States. Over 40% of all water use goes to generating electric power. And while that's important, what's really important is where that water is being used. Water is really a local issue, and it's that kind of intersection between water use, water demands in that area, and the local climate and institutions that really make a difference in terms of if, you know, the issues between water and energy. And so even today, we're seeing impacts of water on the electric power sector. Here we see, and it's a little unusual if you know anything about the United States, the western part of the US is very arid, yet we only see a few cases where water has impacted their ability to operate, usually due to limited water supply. Whereas in the East, where water is much more plentiful, we see many more examples historically of electric power being impacted by water. Usually in these cases, it's been not because of limited water supply, but because of thermal issues, the plants discharging their cooling water back to the river at a higher temperature and thus having to derate because of environmental issues. But it's not just the operations of the power plants which are at risk today, but also the siting of new power plants. We've seen numerous examples of power plants that have not been able to get permits for new development because of water-related issues. We're also concerned going forward in the near future with climate change. We expect, and this is a cascading impact. We see that we'll expect that increased temperatures will lead to increased peak electricity demand. At the same time, these higher temperatures will reduce transmission line capacity as well as the capacity of transformers and substations. It also reduces the thermal efficiency at which our power plants operate, and thus their ability to generate full capacity of electricity. This is the same time when limited water supply could impact hydropower production or production at the thermal power plants, as we just talked about. And then, of course, impacts through forest fires or hurricanes impacting infrastructure. So a number of cascading impacts potentially from climate change. But fortunately, there are some changes going on in our electric system today that are helping to offset some of these current and future impacts. One of the big ones is what we would call fuel switching. We're moving from less or more water intensive forms of generation to less intensive forms of generation. Coal, gas, steam, nuclear were historical powers systems that we rely on. More and more today, we're building natural gas, combined cycle, wind, and solar, which use just a fraction of the water that these historical systems have used. Likewise, we're moving to less intensive forms of cooling. We're moving away from open loop systems, basically that use tens of thousands of gallons of water per megawatt hour of generation, which basically we're just diverting the river through the condenser and back to the river. So all that water is returning back to the water, to the river or lake where it came from, but at a higher temperature, which increases some of the evaporation. Alternatively, we're moving more and more to closed loop systems, at least in the United States, where we're only largely removing the water or withdrawing the water that we use, and that water is being totally used up through evaporative processes, evaporative cooling. So although the consumption's going up a little, the withdrawal is going way, way down, and because we're using less intensive means of or water use systems, overall that consumptive use is coming down a bit. So very positive things that we're seeing. And in fact, these changes are not occurring because we're wanting to save water, but because we are, because of other factors due to the economics of different energy systems, as well as environmental impacts such as emissions and entrainment in impingement of the aquatic species on the intakes of these large open loop systems. So are these changes going to be enough on their own? And as I've already said, water is so local of an issue that these alone are not going to make our systems robust to water and to climate change. And so there are a lot of low-hanging fruit, I believe, that we can take a look at. And here are just a couple. I mean, there are many others, but a couple that we've been looking at. One is just using alternative water sources. And we see a number of new power plants being built using alternative water supplies. We looked at whether we might retrofit some of the existing power plants. And basically, could we move to either dry cooling or using alternative sources of water like municipal wastewater, brackish groundwater. And so we looked across the 1,200 roughly existing thermoelectric power plants and looked at what would be the least cost alternative, considering both the capital and operating maintenance costs to make that switch to non-fresh water. And we also looked at whether municipal wastewater or brackish water was available in those locations where these power plants are. And what we found is the least cost alternative at that time was wastewater. And so the plants would, that would be the least cost alternative for them to switch to. What we also found overall, which was very interesting, that over the half the plants could make this retrofit to a alternative water source. And that cost to make the change would be less than 10% of the current operating cost of that power plant. And even more important, that most of those plants were located out west in basins. Here you can kind of see these that are outlined in red are areas with particular climate issues, particular water scarcity issues, and that over half of those plants were located in these areas. So low-hanging fruit where we could help reduce some of the impacts due to water use by just going to an alternative water supply. A second way that we could help reduce our water footprint, if you will, is just through integrated planning, actually bringing water managers together with power planners. And this is exactly what we did here in the Western United States, where we worked with the WEC, the coordinating council out west here in the US, help bring the different utilities, balancing authorities together to do the long-term planning. Now, while they're very good at doing this transmission expansion planning, capacity expansion planning, they don't normally bring water into that process. And so here we've been able to bring some tools and help them with that. Basically, what we've done is brought some hydrology models in that allow us to look at different climates and how those climates will affect the availability of water for hydropower, as well as thermoelectric power production, as well as how temperatures will affect the demands for electricity going forward, considering different energy futures. And we pull all that together, bring this information into a capacity expansion model, reads from NREL, and we're able to then look at how climate will affect, what will our build out look like 20 years into the future? What generation sources will we choose? And then once we've chosen those, we can then test them with a production cost modeling like Plexos and see how that affects the overall operations of the system, cost, emissions, et cetera. And so, as I mentioned, one of the key issues here is water. And so we first had to map out water availability. So not only just what are the climate effects on the physical supply of water, but also what are the state managers, water managers saying in terms of the institutional controls on that water. Bottom line here, you can see fresh surface water and groundwater here in these upper two panels. The wide areas are where the states are saying those basins are closed to future development of those freshwater supplies. So basically having to look at alternative water supplies and what the additional cost would be is integrated into our modeling. We also have to consider what the impacts are on hydropower. And so here we're seeing different climate models and how those different climates are projecting different impacts on hydropower production in different parts of the United States. So very uncertain, but important is this impact on hydropower and whether it's going to be available, going forward at what level. And so here we can see what these are 4 different future projections, different energy futures. This is the projected change or projected capacity as we move forward in time. The different colors are different types of generation. Yellow being PV, which is, you can see, is big difference across the 4. Wind being this light blue, again, another major difference. And then the natural gas combined cycle. You can see in all of these coal is going down based on the assumptions that we were making with WEC. Here you can see then what the difference is when we add climate into that. The four different energy futures, 4 different climate futures. You can see a big mix, but basically what the bottom line is that we're going to need additional capacity to meet peak load going forward. However, how climate impacts hydropower availability has a big impact on how much additional capacity we'll build and what kind of capacity we build. And then looking at, we're able to look at the production cost modeling to see what the overall impacts on operations will be. Are we able to make our deliveries? Do we keep our margins, our marginal capacities available going forward? We then look at what the impacts on the overall economics. What is it going to cost us? It's interesting here that, overall the added heat is going to increase costs, but really the hydropower is a big kind of offset. In certain future climates, there's more water for hydropower. Hydropower is cheap. So we can see like a plus or minus about $17 billion impact one way or the other, depending on that availability of hydropower going forward and what assumptions we make on that. And also that overall, it's really more important. You can see from here, these 4 different colors or the 4 different energy futures with the lines of different kinds of lines being for the different climates. So you can see it's really the energy future which drives the overall cost of future cost of the system. We also see implications for future water use, big drop in withdrawals, as we mentioned. And again, this is going to be very specific to the WEC. The other interconnections are going to look or could look somewhat different from this. Here, we can see the differences in the different energy futures in consumptive water use. So where we have a lot of renewables added, the consumption comes way down. The other point here is that depending on the climate and depending on its impact on water as well as demands, we can see that where we put that new generation will differ from region to region. So that's going to have an impact on where we site our future energy. So key points here: energy, water, we're seeing impacts already today. And if we don't give them some attention, they're going to intensify. However, some of the changes that are just naturally occurring within our energy and water sectors are helping to mitigate some of these vulnerabilities. However, additional options are going to be necessary in locations because water is so local or so location dependent. So there are a lot of options like just integrated planning that are low hanging that we can do to help offset some of these impacts and uncertainties of a changing climate. So thank you, and I will turn it back over, I guess, to Ning now. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you, Vincent.
There you go.
Hey, so glad to see your faces. I'm glad that I can join you guys. So I think that it's very interesting because Vincent gave us a very technical perspective of blending of water and energy management and to look at the electricity operation and planning in the future for North America, mainly kind of where he's focusing. So I think what will be very interesting is kind of after learning that, we can shift our gear and we will, get some perspective from a different region. So we have Mr. Jorgen Bjordalen. He's a principal consultant at DNV GL Energy. So Jorgen has 30 years of experience as consultants and research economists with electricity industry. And Jorgen, I think it's very interesting because I wanted to share that, when I first called Jorgen about this webinar, I was asking him what was a unique thing about the, connection he can draw of water and energy. I thought, what he has shared with me is the completely different set of challenges with water and energy that they are facing in Nordic region. That's very different from North America. So it's all under the same theme of climate change. So, without further ado, please, Jorgen, take ahead.
So thank you, Ning. I hope I'm sharing my screen now. It seems so.
You are good. Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit on water and energy issues seen from Norway. The perspective is probably not very different, although some different from what Vincent just told us. Some of the details might differ. And there are primarily 2 important issues in this sector that I'll tell you a little bit about. That's the impact of climate change and also the efforts we have in water management more in general. So just a very quick word on DNVGL. It's essentially a quality assurance and risk management company, but we have a very large division in energy or electricity mostly. Where I have a couple of thousand colleagues working with the electricity issues only globally. So when it comes to hydropower, in Europe, Norway is the land of plenty. We have the largest fleet in terms of capacity of hydropower stations in Europe, and we are not that big country, at least not in terms of population. So we have plenty of resources. So here are some key statistics. Currently, approximately 98% of our electricity supply is from hydropower. The share is decreasing because we continuously invest in wind power in this country. Our neighboring country, Sweden, has a share which is approximately half of this of hydropower, but they also expand heavily in wind, and they intend to decommission their nuclear plants over the next couple of decades, although that is a quite contentious political question. Now, the theoretical potential for hydropower in Norway is more than 600 terawatt hours. Most of that is not really available for economic purposes. Approximately 200 terawatt hours could be developed. A quarter of that is protected for environmental and similar reasons. The current capacity is approximately 136 terawatt hours. So there is a remaining potential of some 20 terawatt hours. When it comes to the annual capacity, in terms of energy, that's the expected precipitation corresponds to 136 terawatt hours. It's a huge volatility of this. So typically in a very dry year, we can have down to approximately 100, just short of 100. In a very wet year, we can have more than 170 terawatt hours. There is, of course, no guarantee that we don't have 2 dry years in sequence, or we can have 2 wet years in sequence, or even more. So there are some challenges related to volatility in precipitation. And for that reason, not only for that reason, but partly for that reason, we have also a significant reservoir capacity. So in total, we have approximately half of Europe's storage capacity for hydropower in our Norwegian reservoirs. So we can fairly well manage with current variations in supply and demand, although it requires quite significant connections to our neighbors, so we can have support from them in dry years, and we can help them in when we have surplus of hydropower in our region. So the challenges from the climate change in our region is basically that the weather will be warmer, it will be wetter, and it will be wilder. So there will be more floodings, as you can see from this picture. So this will tend to be more common. Now, the good thing about hydropower is that by building reservoirs and dams, it's easier to control the floodings. And sort of what we experience in terms of situations like on this photograph is much less than it would have been without the hydropower. So that's one of the valuable features, in addition to the power supply, that we can manage the water courses a bit better. Just to illustrate the variability of the weather, the dotted red lines here are the sort of the maximum and minimum registered content of the reservoirs in Norway. The black line is the current or the level for this year. So we are going outside what we have registered for week 41. That's a new historic record. It corresponds to the fact that we do expect higher expected precipitation in the future. For comparison, I can show you 2018, that was a bit more normal year. This is a very wet year. We have had extremely low prices this summer. 2010 was a quite dry year. We had actually determined the sort of the minimum part of the curve for the winter or the autumn was defined in 2010. So this volatility is quite normal and something the electricity sector and the energy supply has learned to cope with. Some of the features of the Norwegian hydropower is that there are quite a lot of requirements on the utilities in terms of environmental protection or measures to protect, for instance, marine life. So anyone with a license to develop a water course for hydropower would typically need to develop things like what's on the picture here, where fish can go upwards in the river, despite there is a turbine somewhere hidden in for this particular water course, the turbine is inside the mountain, but they need to maintain some flow in the rivers so that at least in some parts of the year, fish can go upwards for spawning, for instance. Thus they also develop spawning grounds and ensure there is sufficient flow in the spawning periods. So this, of course, limits how you can utilize a hydropower plant. That's part of the environmental constraints the developers have to deal with. Another requirement or restriction on their operation is related to erosion. So what we, as a major hydropower producer, experience from our neighboring countries is that there is typically high demand previously in peak hours or in the daytime, and low demand and even supply from our neighbors in the night hours. That is partly changing a little bit. So there is high demand from abroad in periods with low wind, and then increasing demand from abroad when in periods with less wind. So one of the sort of the market signals to the hydropower producers is that they will, or the market would like to have more volatile production from the hydropower plants, so that they can produce quite a lot or have a very steep increase in production, typically in the morning or in the afternoon, or decrease in the afternoon. With a very volatile management of one single power plant, there is this risk of erosion of the riverbanks. So there are requirements on that sort of limits the ramp rates for the power plants, among other reasons, to protect the riverbanks and ensure that downstream the power plants, nothing is really destroyed that much. So what you can see on the picture is that's essentially a flooding, not really related to mismanagement of our power plant, but it could have looked this way also with mismanagement of our power plants. And there are indeed requirements then to make sure that power plants are operated also according to what's sort of acceptable for the physical environment downstream. What you can see on this picture is, to just basically sum up, there is this is a reservoir with 8 terawatt-hours of stored energy, and by this such reservoirs and the requirements on managing reservoirs and so on, the energy sector can, by and large, they can manage the volatility that's offered by the nature. Also, the increased volatility is what we expect is manageable. It might be challenging for some of the reservoirs. So quite a few have actually, they had to increase the height of their dams with a minor amount. Also, some of the dams, they are quite old. They are older than me. So these dams, they are as we speak, they are modernized and reinforced because of the volatility in water supply, among other things. So that was sort of the first issue. The second issue is, I'd like to tell you a little bit about, is a bit more about the regulatory approach to water resource management in Norway and in Europe. So let me start with Norway. In more than 100 years ago, almost 150 years ago, Norway institutionalized the private property rights for rivers and river systems. That was a bit different than in our neighboring countries. But then 20 years later, the parliament, they got panic as they realized that foreign capital were taking ownership to Norwegian watercourses. So they essentially agreed upon an act that made it such that all foreign investors and all private investors, they needed a license from the government or the parliament, depending on the details, to take ownership to a river system. And then in addition, if you wanted to build a power plant, you also needed a separate license. So after some years, they revised this act, and it's basically the act we have today. It empowers the government to set conditions for any private utilization of water resources. That is not only related to sort of the management of the water and how we protect marine life on the water course, but also related to other public interests like recreational use of the water courses and perhaps more importantly for the last couple of decades about taxations and what sort of payments the developer have to offer both the local communities as well as the state. And the main principle that continues that the owner's utilization of watercourses, that's subject to public control. And it requires a quite holistic river basin management plans with annual, or with not with annual, but with regular revisions. So this trend has been sort of reinforced, or this policy has been, type of policy has been reinforced by, at the European level, by the EU Water Framework Directive, which is an even more holistic approach to setting public requirements on how the water courses are managed, how plans are developed, making sure that all relevant interests are heard, that every now and then, I can't recall how frequent, whether it's every 10 or every 20 years, the water authority, the national authority, would have to look through the conditions to check whether all necessary requirements are implemented or whether there is scope for new requirements, whether, for instance, for environmental concerns, the water status, for instance, requires that the power plant is managed quite differently in the future as it has as compared to previous operation. And this directive then empowers the regulators to modify conditions when there are sufficient reasons. And then sort of the newer parts of this is, and also what's new for Norway, is that it's both, or basically these two items, sort of the very integrated approach and the high focus on monitoring the status of the water courses. That's essentially the new efforts or new features of the in Norwegian legislation as well. However, this is a status map from WWF that's 1 or 2 years old. It says essentially that most European countries, they struggle to implement this directive. It's a bit strange. It's 2 decades old. if you notice, Norway is not colored in the map. Norway is not the EU member, but we typically adopt their directives, so we have to comply with them. But then quite often how we comply with them is not really that well measured. So in a sense, the complexity of the task of managing water resources is illustrated by all the exceptions applied by European countries from this directive. It is a big regulatory task to do this properly. It appears that most of the conflicting areas, they are not so much related to energy as to more about pollution of water, rivers, etc., and need for wildlife and recreational use of the water courses. Having said this, as far as I understand, the regulators are quite optimistic that somehow they will manage to cope with these challenges and sort of, in a sense, get in line. But it takes time, and hopefully not too long time. So by this, I simply end up my presentation with that's actually a very old power plant. It's a museum. The new power plant is inside a mountain, so you can't see it anymore. But the prospects for hydropower are quite good in Norway and in the Nordic area as well, or that basically means Sweden, because in Denmark there is nothing, and in Finland it's quite limited. But most of the potential is already developed. And the challenges in Norway and Sweden are a bit different than those in Europe, because we do not have that much pollution issues in our water courses. It's more about water management and reservoir management and managing the flows, the flow into the rivers, in particular downstream the power plants. So with that, I say thank you, and back to you, Ning.
Thank you. Thank you, Jürgen. That was very interesting. So we have our last speaker, last but not least, we have Senator Chris Hansen. Senator Chris Hansen represents District 31 in the Colorado State Senate, and he specializes in energy sector economics and data analytics with 20 years experience. Actually, and before joined, started his career in politics, and he actually was a senior director at IHS Sarah for global product, energy product, and also he currently still the co-founder of the Colorado Science and Engineering Policy Fellowship, as well as co-founder and director of programming at the Colorado Energy and Water Institute. And one of the things I would share about with Chris was interesting is I was very interested about his perspective, because when I first talked to Chris about this webinar, I said, well, Chris, a lot of our energy economists, we talk about policy issues and we look at strategies. And I have to applaud that Chris have taken that initiative to one step further into his own hand and to tackle the challenges. So that's quite interesting. So Chris, so love to hear about your perspective about water and energy, and especially with policymakers.
All right. Well, Ning, thank you. It's really a pleasure to join everybody today. And as a one-time member of USAEE myself, and in fact, I'm going to rejoin after this seminar. So I really appreciate everybody making room for me today and squeezing in a politician among the real energy economists. What I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about the energy transition in the West and pick up on Vincent's remarks. I think we're in a period of very rapid transition. Those of you that are familiar with U.S. power system are very aware of this. And we're in a moment where we are rapidly closing down our coal plants and very quickly shifting to wind, solar, with some gas for system stability. And there's a huge opportunity in the United States and in the West in particular. And I would say, in Colorado, we are looking at probably the last use of coal in about 2030. So this is going to happen very fast. We've got 10 plants that are still open. I'm going to talk about those here in just a second. And those are all likely to be closed by the end of the decade. And that has huge implications on the economy of the state, how it affects individual communities, how it affects the workers in those communities. And so I want to share with you a little bit of a case study of how we are shifting from these coal plants and how it fits in kind of a case study to Vincent's overall story about how we're managing power and water interplay in the Western United States. So what we did in Colorado in 2019, a bill that I sponsored to basically accelerate the closure of the coal plants in Colorado. And one of the main tools that we use to do that, really two things. One, we put the social cost of carbon, $46 a ton, into the planning assumptions for capacity expansion in the state. So that, of course, that's going to put a huge burden in the modeling on the fossil plants, particularly coal. If they're going to continue to operate, they would have to absorb that assumption. And second, we created a securitization tool. So we created a bonding mechanism to pay off the stranded asset portion of the coal plant. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's important in Colorado. So here's a kind of a sample of what book value of coal plants look like across the United States. Many of them were built in the 70s and 80s. You have the original construction here. Let's just, for argument's sake, say it was $1 billion. That then gets depreciated over time and the ratepayers pay that off. And so, of course, there are lots of changes to that coal plant over the life of its operation. You might have a boiler upgrade. You might have pollution controls come back in, efficiency improvements that get put into the rate base for that coal plant. And so that coal plant just continues to rejuvenate its book value, and therefore the stranded asset problem continues for coal plants, even if they might be 40 or 50 years old. And that's what we're seeing with some of the plants in Colorado. So what we did in Senate Bill 236 was to create a bonding tool to handle the remaining asset value on these coal plants. Colorado joined 24 other states that already have this in place. And you can see the states in red, Montana, Colorado, New Mexico, that all passed securitization bills in 2019. And then the red dots are the states that are currently considering securitization bills for similar sets of reasons. Now, why does securitization help the customer? Well, if you use a bond as opposed to a depreciation or accelerated depreciation, you quickly pay off the utility, handle that stranded asset, and then you have money available to purchase lower cost replacement power. And so here in this example, you can see we've replaced the coal capacity with wind and solar and batteries, and that drastically increases the cost efficiency for the customer. You can see it along the bottom of the page there. The status quo is about $55 a megawatt hour. If you use accelerated depreciation, that goes up because, of course, you're paying that off more quickly. Or if you use securitization, you drop that almost by 50% down to about $30 per megawatt hour of cost. And so it's a huge savings on a dollar and cents basis for the customer. It also immediately gets rid of those emission profiles. And so the environment is also the big winner in this transition. Now, to the interplay with water and the point of our discussion this morning. The coal plants operating in these 7 states that I've got across, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and Montana, and Wyoming, consumed a massive amount of water. And we saw that in Vincent's presentation, huge amount of consumption for thermoelectric power plants. I give you some of the statistics here for those 7 states. And that it comes to, 76 billion gallons each year for the coal plants in these states. And so as we think about the rapid closure or retirement of these units, we now have this tremendous opportunity for using that water for other important purposes. And so path one, as we just keep going, as things status quo, business as usual, this is what it looks like. Huge amount of water that will be used from each of these basins. I really love Vincent's point about the local nature of this, but also keep in mind that Colorado is the headwater state for the rest of the West. And so Colorado River Basin, which Los Angeles area, the Phoenix area, heavily dependent on the Colorado Basin. If we don't do a good job of water management in the headwater state, it's going to cause a huge amount of difficulty downstream. And so, yes, it's very local, but in this case, the West is dependent on several large watersheds and basins, the Colorado River being foremost among those. And so these coal plants on the western side of Colorado have a huge impact on the total amount of water available in that basin. And you can see here the kind of idea that even if we take the carbon emission constraints and instead of closing the coal plants, we use CCS, we're actually making the water consumption situation more difficult because CCS technology also uses a lot of water. And so that's really kind of the problem with path number one. Path number two is we use securitization, quickly close down these coal plants. And you can see the specific units that I'm referring to in Colorado that are owned all or in part by Xcel. There's huge savings available for the customers. And here I quantify that. It's about $500 million in net present value savings to the customer if we close down these units, replace it with wind, solar, and batteries. And it would be about $1.5 billion total savings for the customer because of the lower marginal cost of the electricity as well. So the economic case, the environmental case is very, very robust. And I think the water angle to this only strengthens the argument that we need to close down these coal units immediately. So if we think about path number two and all of the water that would be freed up, tens of thousands of acre feet per coal unit, we could save a tremendous amount of water. And I think what makes this really interesting is that you can then use that water to help spur economic development in the places where you've just lost jobs at either the coal mine or the coal plant or both. And we do have one example of a mine mouth coal plant here in Colorado. And so jobs will be affected, but if the water is used to support innovative, high efficiency agriculture programs, I loved Jorgen's point about making sure that we've got riparian flows for the fish, for the birds, et cetera. That leads to more tourism, which of course leads to more sales tax and income tax in these areas. And so I think it's going to be incumbent on Colorado and the Western states to really think carefully about how to repurpose this water, make sure that we are meeting the needs on the environmental side, make sure that we are using these water rights that are now freed up for high efficiency agriculture to create more jobs and create more tax base in these places that are going to be losing the largest taxpayer typically in the region, the coal plant. So I think that's a huge opportunity for the West, something that we're exploring in great depth in Colorado, something we're trying to support with state level policy. Of course, the water stress, you saw some of this from Vincent's presentation, but things in the West are getting worse, not better. Climate change is exacerbating the water stress in the region. And so you can see all the black dots here are the coal plants. As those close down, we've got a chance to really repurpose that water and do so in a smart and efficient way. And I think that's going to be such an important piece of this energy transition that we're in the middle of in the state of Colorado and across the country. And so thanks so much for letting me share a few thoughts this morning. A very, very warm hello from Denver, and I look forward to the conversation and the questions.
Well, thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. That was very interesting, very energetic too. So I think we have some questioning coming in. So I think one of the question that came in, I think that it was answered by Jordan, but I'm going to pose to you guys, and I think that maybe Vincent and Chris, you guys have a different answer. So there's a question from Anna, that a big picture question to all presenters. How do you think about application of machine learning and AI will help us preserve water resource in the future? Is there any new insights from digital twins of water body? So what do you guys think? Any comments?
Sure, this is Vince. One place I see there, well, a couple of places, I think. I know a lot of work has been going on to understanding behaviors in terms of water use, particularly at the municipal level, as you change costs of water and the design of your water rates, how people will respond. I think there's a lot of work that could be done there with AI in being able to kind of better understand and model those behaviors. Another place I see that there's some value being with, as Jorgen particularly pointed out, just the importance of the way we operate the reservoirs. Being able, particularly when we're trying to model at scales of, say, the Western United States or Norway, or at these larger scales, really getting the operational rules right in our water resource models, and then coupling them to the energy models, particularly the production cost models, which are looking at the dispatch of individual generating sources, using historical data and using some of the AI to develop rules that are realistic and also incorporate the management, that the human element in the management of each individual reservoir, and how the uncertainty and how the climate is unfolding over the next week, next month, next 6 months, how that affects operations. So I think those are two places in particular that I would see AI being very, very valuable.
Thank you, Vincent. Chris, any comments?
Yeah, I would just quickly add that I think the point I was making about high efficiency agriculture, drip irrigation, some of the greenhouse concepts that I've seen for places like Western Colorado, they all heavily integrate IoT into their operations. They're using AI to constantly adjust to maximize the efficiency of that water use. And I think we're just at the very tip of the iceberg of that technology across things like high efficiency agriculture and water and energy management. We're going to see this spread very, very quickly. And I think it's just incumbent on us, particularly in the Western United States, to better integrate our grids. We right now, the WEC is just a coordinating council. We do not have an RTO in the West. We badly need to move to an RTO. And I think the AI technology that's come into grid management, helping us to be more resilient, and then stitching the 38 independent grids in the West together will only help us to do an even better job of managing the electricity and water nexus. And I think we're going to see huge gains in that over the next 10 years.
Interesting. I just have a quick question about this for both of you, Vincent and Chris. Do you guys see that, are there any monitoring that is actually across different, electric markets in the West right now that is actually active in real time?
Well, we're taking some initial steps that way. I mean, the West is starting to create an energy imbalance market and are looking at an energy day ahead market for power dispatch. Both of those will improve our system management, but they are just a fraction of the efficiency gain that you can get if you move to a full RTO or ISO, so regional transmission organization or independent system operator. And that's one of the things we'll be working on at a policy level across the Western states. I'm talking with my legislative colleagues and the governor's office, et cetera, about moving more quickly in that direction. And that will have a huge benefit for water management as well.
That's good. That's good to hear. So there's more question coming. I'm going to bounce a little bit back to Chris and let you take a few minutes break, and we'll come back to you. So there's a question from Marie Fagan. Thank you, Marie. Question for Mr. Bjørndalen. So for Jørgen, how does Norway manage electricity capacity planning, given that a hydro-dependent system is energy constrained rather than capacity constrained?
Thank you. And quite interesting question. The capacity issue in Norway is mostly left to the market, which means if demand grows faster than supply, prices will increase and ultimately encourage someone to invest in a new power plant. Short-term increased prices will simply increase imports, but long-term someone will consider developing a new power plant or refurbishing an old one. The same thing happens in dry years and under cold spells. Our TSO, or similar to your ISOs, has some responsibility to ensure sufficient capacity, but that is essentially more like an emergency measure. We do not really expect anyone to take better reservoir management decisions than the contestable or competitive utilities themselves, because they have actually better knowledge about reservoir management, reservoir constraints, reservoir opportunities than any regulatory body would ever have. So the simple answer is that the capacity issue is essentially left to the market. And we trust that the market will actually deliver on that.
So thank you, Jørgen. So I'm got the next question. Water desalination, either through thermal or electric energy-based technology projects are growing in the US. Such process has high impact on the environment given the thermal discharge and brine. Please shed some light on this issue.
Sure, it's definitely an issue that I think folks are well aware of. I think I would point folks in particular to a new project that's being funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, NAWI, North American Water Initiative. No, I don't, but NAWI, you can find it on the web. It's a $100 million program over 5 years plus cost share that are looking particularly at desalination. And one of the key focuses of this work will be on this brine issue. In fact, they just released a FOA to compete out some new technologies. So looking at early stage technologies for treatment. I think an important component of that is also looking whether you can monetize some of the brine waste and put those to economic value instead of just dumping them in a landfill. So there are multiple dimensions to that activity. There'll be a big roadmap coming out soon that will address some of those issues, provide some indication of what the current state of the art is, and then what some of the leading technologies are to improving on that current technology. So I would say watch for that very closely in the next, into the early part of next year's when these are supposed to be submitted, these roadmaps.
Thank you, Vincent. So the next question is from Michael Young for Senator Hansen. what is actually being scrutinized and who is buying, trading the assets? If the coal plant is closing, what is the value of the facility and how is a closed plant being monetized?
All right, it's a great question. Yeah, unfortunately, that's probably another hour seminar on securitization. Very happy to follow up with you directly, Michael. If you want to drop me a line, I'd be happy to give you more detail. But just quickly, what is being securitized is the remaining value of that plant. And so the stranded asset, so let's say in the numerical example I gave, the coal plant is still worth $500 million on its books. You use AAA corporate bonds that are supported by a ratepayer charge that pays off that bond over 20 or 30 years, whatever term is decided as optimal. The utility then gets a check for $500 million, which they can immediately use to reinvest in wind solar batteries. And that plant is then retired and taken off the books. So it has zero value at that point. It's gone, it's done. You can chop it up for surplus steel and recycle the steel. And it's not monetized. And instead of paying, $30 to $40 a megawatt hour for that coal power, you've now replaced it with wind, solar, and batteries that are between 17 and about 25 in Colorado right now, dollars per megawatt hour on a levelized basis. So that's the trade. You're basically using the bonds to get the coal plant off the books and retired.
That's a short version for 1 hour. Thank you, Chris. So next question for Chris. There is actually a question about storage.
Sure.
So as the case of replacing coal plants with renewables and storage is a key of components of the system reliability. So is there any sufficient storage capacity for the transition from coal to renewable? What is a plan to address this?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from the other panelists too. I'll just quickly say the shorter answer right now is no, absolutely not. We have some growth in lithium ion technology. In Colorado, what we're seeing is a co-location of the solar with the battery facility, and it allows the solar plant to extend into the evening peak. And so the sun goes down at 7 and the batteries allow that power to be available into 8, 9 o'clock hour when the peak load often hits during the summer months. We also in Colorado are fortunate, I'm guessing like Norway, to have pumped storage. Colorado mountains lend itself to about 700 megawatts of pump storage capacity. That is the ultimate battery right now. In the future, my guess is that we're going to see a lot of green hydrogen production. So we'll use any excess wind and solar instead of constraining that capacity, we'll use it to create hydrogen. That would be my guess in Colorado, that we'll have a lot of green hydrogen production by 2030. So that's the storage outlook at the moment. We are certainly not there, which is also why we need to better integrate our grid, because that would reduce the need for as much storage on a local basis.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone else wanted to take up this question?
If I may, the question about pumped hydro storage has been frequently raised in Norway, and some utilities, they sort of calculate the business case each year. However, the market value of a pumped storage facility in Norway is way below the capital cost, which simply means in our system, we have more than sufficient flexibility and more than sufficient storage. We do some analysis in some of our neighboring countries looking into this, and what we think is important is, in addition to sort of the short-term storage like batteries and so on, it's important to recognize that whereas we in the past used to consider demand as something fixed and given, and where supply should adjust, it's also a matter of sort of encouraging demand side to participate in covering or dealing with the volatility of supply. Quite a lot of the electricity usage or the purposes of using electricity going forward will be quite flexible. It's just a matter of adaptation and mindset, and to a smaller extent, a matter of sort of investment costs, or perhaps a matter of behavior. But of course, for some purposes, it's not really possible to be flexible at all. But for quite a lot of the new purposes of electricity demand, replacing use of fossil fuels in cars, for instance, there is much flexibility, quite a lot.
Thank you, Jürgen. Okay, so one more question coming. How do you compare using microalgae for water treatment according to other techniques?
I'm not any expert on microalgae, but again, here I would almost argue that, again, it's a bit like water overall. It is certainly, location really matters when it comes down, and the viability of microalgae, you know, again, it really is dependent on a number of things. And opportunities to integrate it as a energy source itself with water treatment or use in waters of you know, marginal value. So being able to get both a water treatment and an energy source out of the microalgae is probably the kinds of things that you're going to need to be looking for, and how then that, you know, that levels up with other kinds of approaches for treating water, whether you're using to spare heat off of your power plants to run some kind of desalination, or can we extract energy from our wastewater streams through biogas or other kinds of treatments, you know. So again, it's going to be a trade-off largely, you know, many times depending on, you know, the specifics of the location that you're talking about.
Thank you, Vincent. Actually, I actually have a question just for Jürgen. You talked quite a bit about the EU system that, you know, they tried to have a very holistic view, which is approach for the management, which is I think it's very noble approach for that. But with all the changes, you know, like for you know, in Central Europe, all the, you know, like in Germany, there are new energy plans, you know, phasing out coal, and also now there is a lot more you know, initiatives about hydrogen. Do you see that, how that would affect hydro for you guys in Nordic region?
No, I don't think it really impacts, or what they achieve or doesn't achieve on the in continental Europe doesn't really impact Norway that much, or the Nordic region. At least not in the, or not in the electricity market in a sense. The sort of the major, or the flow of electricity between the Nordic and the continental Europe is essentially determined by wind patterns and sort of whether it's much or less wind, and whether it's dry or a wet season in the Nordic. So it's sort of basically those two major factors determining the flow, and to which extent they succeed or do not succeed with sort of a good sort of water management results in continental Europe does not really change that picture that much. So previously we have had impacts, for instance, when it was in very warm summers, some of the thermal power plants in continental Europe had to close down due to constraints on cooling. That meant quite a lot for prices in the Nordic region, but that will be less important as these thermal plants will be phased out over the next couple of decades.
Yeah. In Norway also, I think that you guys also produce at the same time, besides hydro, you guys also do quite a bit of oil and gas currently, and you're still exporting gas, right? For yeah, at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you guys are definitely support them in a different way, in multiple different ways. Okay, cool. I wonder if there's other questions, but if there's not, I think there's questions that if our slides will be available, yes, we will have the slides available online and after the webinar. So thank you guys very much. And thanks for the speakers for their expertise and really interesting presentations. I think, we hope that this discussion would really help the audience to engage your mind and encourage you to think about, the connection between water and energy in different approach and different viewpoints for your own work. So thank you, everybody. And Dave?
Thank you, Ning. Thank you. Wish to thank Ning, Lynn, and our distinguished panelists for just an outstanding webinar. I truly learned quite a bit myself. I'm very grateful for your time and your expertise. For our listeners, this has been recorded, will be available on our Rewind. Please share this with your friends and your colleagues. I wish you a good rest of the day wherever this finds you on our fine globe. And thank you once again. I officially close this webinar.